At first, it looked like an almost unimaginable crime inside an ordinary home in Jackson, Mississippi. 3 people were dead: 2 sisters, LaTanya and Shanice, and a 2-year-old boy whose life had barely begun. But as investigators examined the scene, one detail made the case even more disturbing. The toddler had been found in his bed, and authorities would later say his death did not appear to be the result of accidental crossfire. Someone, it seemed, had deliberately attacked this home. But why? In the immediate aftermath, a vehicle connected to the residence disappeared. Then came what appeared to be a breakthrough. 2 men were arrested and charged with capital murder. Yet the arrests were not the end. Another alleged participant would soon emerge, and investigators believed others might still be involved. So what happened inside that house? And why was an innocent 2-year-old caught in what authorities described as an allegedly targeted attack? June 27, 2026. Queen Alexandria Lane in Jackson, Mississippi. It was a Saturday night in a residential neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing from the outside suggested that one home was about to become the center of a triple homicide investigation. Shortly after 9:15 p.m., Jackson police officers responded to what had initially been reported as an aggravated assault. Then they entered the residence. Inside, officers discovered 3 victims: Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and 2-year-old Kamari Given. All 3 had suffered gunshot wounds. But one discovery would make this case especially difficult to comprehend. Kamari was found in his bed. Authorities later indicated that the toddler's shooting did not appear to have been accidental crossfire, a detail that reportedly weighed heavily even on experienced investigators trying to understand what had happened inside the home. Outside, another piece of the puzzle was already missing. A red Mitsubishi Mirage belonging to one of the victims was gone. Police now had 3 people dead, a missing vehicle, and no publicly identified motive explaining why this particular residence had apparently been attacked. In the surrounding neighborhood, residents struggled to process the violence. Some reportedly said they had mistaken the sounds of gunfire for fireworks. But investigators were about to receive their first major lead. The missing Mitsubishi would soon reappear. And when police found it, the vehicle was there, but whoever had taken it had already disappeared. At the center of this case was 25-year-old Kiana Weathersby, the mother of 2-year-old Kamari Given. Kamari was the youngest of the 3 victims, a child whose age alone would become one of the most painful elements of the investigation. He was not simply present in the home that night. According to what authorities would later say about the circumstances of his death, investigators had reason to believe his shooting was not merely the accidental consequence of bullets being fired around him. Also inside the home was Kiana's older sister, 30-year-old Erica Weathersby, Kamari's aunt. In the days after the killings, their brother, DeMarco Bailey, spoke publicly about the women his family had lost. He described his sisters as kind and easygoing, women who focused on working and supporting themselves. His words offered a glimpse of the people behind the names now appearing in headlines. The sisters were close, and both played a role in caring for Kamari. That made the loss almost impossible for their family to separate into individual tragedies. 2 sisters were gone. A mother was gone. An aunt was gone. And at the center of that devastation was a 2-year-old child whose life had ended inside the place where he should have been safest. For residents around Queen Alexandria Lane, the violence was difficult to reconcile with the neighborhood they knew. Neighbors reportedly had not expected something of this magnitude to happen there. As news of the triple homicide spread, shock turned into grief and anger. A memorial appeared outside the home, marking the place where 3 lives had been taken. But Kamari's death gave the case an especially devastating weight. Local officials and law enforcement publicly condemned the violence, with the killing of such a young child generating extraordinary outrage. For investigators, however, emotion could not answer the most important question: why this family? As the investigation developed, police revealed a critical detail. They did not believe the attack was random. Authorities would eventually confirm that the alleged attackers and the victims were known to one another in some capacity, though investigators withheld the exact nature of that connection. that changed how the entire crime had to be understood. If this home had been intentionally selected, then someone had arrived on Queen Alexandria Lane knowing where they were going and perhaps knowing who they expected to find. The missing Mitsubishi suggested someone had also left with something that could be tracked. Now investigators had to determine what connection had brought the alleged attackers to that address. And to understand that, they first had to reconstruct the night 3 lives were taken. By approximately 9:15 p.m. on June 27, 2026, Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and 2-year-old Kamari Given were inside the residence on Queen Alexandria Lane. What happened next has not been fully reconstructed for the public. Investigators have released important pieces of the case, but the exact sequence inside the house, including precisely how the confrontation began, where each person was positioned, and who allegedly fired each shot, has not been publicly established in complete detail. Those unanswered questions matter, particularly because the criminal cases connected to the killings remain subject to the court process. What is known as devastating. Kiana, Erica, and Kamari were shot multiple times, and when officers eventually entered the residence, Kamari was found in his bed. That detail immediately separated this case from many shootings in which a child is tragically struck by a bullet never intended for them. Police statements indicated that investigators did not believe Kamari's death appeared to be the result of accidental crossfire. In other words, according to the direction of the investigation, his presence in that bed could not simply be dismissed as a terrible accident occurring during violence aimed elsewhere. For investigators, that changed the character of the crime. For the public, it made the case almost impossible to comprehend. But understanding what happened required answering a much larger question. Who had come to the house that night? And what did each person know before they arrived? Police would later characterize the attack as intentional and targeted. And as the investigation developed, authorities began describing an alleged transportation arrangement that would become central to the case. According to investigators, Michaela Young allegedly drove Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter to the Queen Alexandria Lane residence. That allegation is connected to pending criminal charges and should not be understood as a proven finding of guilt. The full extent of what each accused person allegedly knew, intended, or agreed to remains a matter for the legal process. According to police accounts reported publicly, Young allegedly drove away after hearing gunfire, leaving the 2 men behind. That account raises one of the most important unresolved questions in the case. What did each alleged participant understand before arriving at the residence? Investigators have made allegations about roles and movements, but the complete answer, the conversations before the trip, the intentions of those involved, and whether every person allegedly connected to the event understood what was going to happen, has not been fully established publicly. Back on Queen Alexandria Lane, however, the violence had already left 3 victims behind, and something else was now missing. A red 2020 Mitsubishi Mirage belonging to one of the victims had been taken from the property. At that early stage, the disappearance of the vehicle created another layer of uncertainty. Publicly available information did not immediately establish every detail of how the Mitsubishi left the residence or precisely who drove it away. But from an investigative perspective, a missing vehicle represented something tangible. Unlike unanswered motives or private conversations, a car could potentially be seen. It could be located. It could be examined. And it could possibly contain physical or digital evidence capable of revealing where it had been after leaving the crime scene. Meanwhile, outside the house, Queen Alexandria Lane still looked like a residential neighborhood on a Saturday night. The contrast was difficult to process. Behind one set of walls, 3 people, including a 2-year-old child, had been shot. Beyond them were homes, streets, and neighbors, some of whom reportedly initially mistook the sounds for fireworks. Then the police arrived. What had first been reported as an aggravated assault became something far more serious when officers discovered Kiana, Erica, and Kamari. Now investigators had a triple homicide. They also had a missing red Mitsubishi. And that vehicle quickly became one of the first concrete leads capable of moving the investigation beyond the walls of the house. The following day, June 28th, authorities located the 2020 Mitsubishi Mirage abandoned and unoccupied at Manhattan Park in North Jackson. No suspect was waiting beside it. No immediate explanation came with its discovery. But the vehicle itself could still speak in ways a person might not. Authorities secured the Mitsubishi for forensic processing, with federal assistance reportedly becoming part of that examination. Investigators could now begin searching for evidence that might connect the car's movements and the people who had come into contact with it to the killings on Queen Alexandria Lane. Whoever abandoned that Mitsubishi may have believed they had removed an important connection to the crime. But the vehicle was only one part of a much larger trail, and investigators were already beginning to follow it. From a moment investigators began working the scene on Queen Alexandria Lane, they faced three connected questions. Who had targeted this family? Why had they been targeted? And how many people had participated? The residence itself became the starting point. Investigators processed the crime scene while attempting to reconstruct what could be established from the evidence left behind. Authorities would later publicly reference physical, digital, and forensic evidence as important parts of the investigation. But many of the specific findings have not been fully released. There has not necessarily been a public accounting of every DNA result, fingerprint comparison, ballistic conclusion, or trajectory analysis connected to the case. That distinction is important. Investigators may possess information that has not yet been presented publicly, especially while criminal proceedings remain active. One piece of evidence, however, was impossible to ignore: the missing red 2020 Mitsubishi Mirage. When a vehicle was discovered abandoned and unoccupied at Manhattan Park in North Jackson on June 28th, investigators secured it for processing. The FBI assisted with examining the recovered vehicle, adding federal resources to an investigation already moving quickly. But forensic evidence was only one part of the developing picture. The community was another. Tips reportedly began reaching investigators soon after the killings became public. Detectives conducted interviews, followed information provided by residents, and worked to combine those accounts with electronic and technological evidence. Police would later credit both modern technology and traditional detective work with helping move the case forward. That combination became critical. A camera, a digital record, or another piece of electronic information can point investigators in a direction. But someone still has to determine what that information means. Detectives still have to interview people, compare timelines, test accounts, and identify connections. Gradually, the investigation moved toward its first major breakthrough. Authorities identified another vehicle they believed was connected to the homicide investigation. Officers attempted to stop that vehicle near Interstate 55 and Maddox Road. According to police, the driver did not immediately comply. The attempted traffic stop developed into a tense encounter before officers eventually surrounded the vehicle. Two men were then taken into custody without further incident. They were identified as 28-year-old Cornelius Carter and 28-year-old Jordan Carter. Despite sharing the same surname, police specifically stated that the two men were not related. Both were charged with capital murder in connection with the deaths of Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and Kamari Given. Cornelius Carter also faced an additional charge related to possession of a firearm as a convicted felon. Those charges are accusations. They do not, by themselves, establish guilt, and the allegations against both defendants must be tested through the legal process. The vehicle in which the men were stopped reportedly gave investigators another potentially important source of evidence. Police said weapons were recovered, but their discovery did not automatically establish that any particular weapon had been used on Queen Alexandria Lane. Authorities indicated that the firearms would need to undergo forensic and ballistic examination before investigators could determine whether any of them were connected to the murders. That testing could become significant. But publicly, police were careful not to announce conclusions before the examination was complete. Cornelius and Jordan later made their initial court appearances, where they were reportedly denied bond. For a community searching for answers, two arrests might have looked like the beginning of the end of the investigation. Police made clear that it was not. The case remained active. and investigators began revealing details that made the killings appear more complicated than a random act of violence. Authorities said the murders were not random. They described what happened at the Queen Alexandria Lane residence as intentional and targeted. Even more significantly, police acknowledged that the suspects and the victims knew one another in some capacity, but they declined to publicly explain the precise relationship. That silence created an obvious question. If investigators knew there was a connection, why not reveal it? In an active homicide case, information about motive and relationships can be strategically important. Releasing too much could potentially affect witness interviews, alert additional suspects to what investigators know, or complicate evidence that prosecutors may later need to present in court. So the public was given only part of the picture. The victims allegedly knew those accused of involvement. The home had apparently been intentionally selected, but the reason remained hidden. And then there was Kamari. Police indicated that the 2-year-old had been in bed when he was killed. Available information, authorities said, did not suggest that his death could simply be explained as a child accidentally caught in crossfire. That statement changed the central mystery again. If the attack was targeted, what could possibly explain the killing of a 2-year-old child? Investigators were not publicly answering that question, but they were saying something else. The 2 men already in custody might not represent everyone connected to what happened. Police publicly indicated that additional people were being investigated as detectives continued examining evidence, interviews, relationships, and movements surrounding the night of June 27th. That possibility meant every new detail carried greater significance. The abandoned Mitsubishi, the second vehicle, the recovered weapons, the digital evidence, the community tips, and whatever investigators had learned about the relationship between the victims and the accused. Piece by piece, a larger structure was beginning to emerge. Then the investigation produced another name, and with it came an allegation that changed the understanding of how the accused men may have arrived at Queen Alexandria Lane in the first place. The arrests of Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter had been a major breakthrough, but they were not the end of the story. For a brief moment, the first 2 arrests created the appearance of resolution. Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter had been taken into custody. Both faced capital murder charges. Weapons had reportedly been recovered from the vehicle in which they were stopped, and investigators had publicly described the killings as intentional and targeted. It seemed as though the investigation was moving toward a conclusion, but detectives believed the case extended beyond those 2 men. Then another name emerged. 25-year-old Michaela Young was also charged with capital murder. According to investigators, Young allegedly drove Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter to the victim's home on Queen Alexandria Lane. Police accounts further alleged that she left after hearing gunfire, leaving the 2 men behind. Those allegations introduced a more complicated question about criminal responsibility. Under the prosecution theory described publicly, a person may potentially face serious criminal liability for knowingly participating in the commission of an underlying felony, even as reflected in the available public statements and source material. The criminal case remains centered on 3 accused individuals. Cornelius Carter faces capital murder allegations in connection with the deaths of Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and 2-year-old Kamari Given, along with an additional firearm-related charge. Jordan Carter also faces capital murder allegations. Michaela Young faces a capital murder allegation connected to what investigators describe as her alleged role surrounding the attack. All 3 are accused. The charges against them should not be understood as convictions unless and until guilt is established through the legal process. During initial court proceedings, bond was reportedly denied for the identified defendants discussed in the available source material. But investigators also made clear that their work did not necessarily end with those arrests. Authorities continued examining the possibility that additional people may have been involved. One crucial piece remains hidden from public view: the motive. Police have said the killings were intentional and targeted, and that the accused and victims knew one another in some capacity. Yet the precise relationship, and the reason this family was allegedly targeted, has not been publicly disclosed in the available material. Authorities indicated that revealing certain details could jeopardize the continuing investigation. For the surviving family, however, the case is not simply an investigation. DeMarco Bailey has publicly called for justice for his two sisters and his young nephew. Community members have offered support, including efforts to help the family with funeral expenses as they confront the loss of three relatives at once. The case reportedly affected investigators and first responders as well. Police described the circumstances, particularly Kamari's death, as deeply difficult even for experienced personnel accustomed to confronting violent crime. The arrests represent significant progress, but arrests are not the conclusion of the legal process. Court proceedings must still examine the evidence, determine individual responsibility, and test the allegations made by investigators and prosecutors. And until that process unfolds, the questions surrounding Queen Alexandria Lane remain. What motivated the attack? What did each accused person know? Were others involved? And why did an allegedly targeted act of violence end with two sisters and a 2-year-old child dead?